I woke up that morning thinking it would be just another quiet, ordinary day. The sun was peeking through the blinds, the coffee smelled amazing, and I could hear my kid humming while packing his backpack. It was the kind of morning that makes you feel like life is manageable, predictable, even peaceful. I had no idea it was about to turn into something out of a sitcom. I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside just in time to see my kid waiting at the bus stop. Everything looked normal at first. The leaves were still wet from the morning dew, a few neighbors were quietly tending to their lawns, and the bus was due in a few minutes. Then she appeared. Karen HOA Karen, and she wasn't just walking, she was storming. Arms flailing, face red like a cartoon character who had just discovered someone had committed a grave injustice. In her world, apparently my kid's backpack was a federal offense. I could see her marching toward the bus stop, her HOA rulebook clutched tightly in one hand, her other hand waving like she was conducting an invisible orchestra. "She's here," I muttered under my breath, trying to suppress a laugh. My kid, oblivious to the approaching hurricane, was happily adjusting his backpack straps, probably thinking the only challenge of the day would be finding his seat on the bus. Karen didn't even glance at the other neighbors, her focus was laser-sharp, zeroed in on my child. "Excuse me, young man or young lady, this backpack is completely unacceptable. The colors don't comply with the neighborhood standards and I will not allow this." I froze. Did she just yell at a 7-year-old about colors? I wanted to laugh, but I also felt my blood pressure rising. This was exactly the kind of petty, absurd confrontation that gives HOA stories their legendary reputation. The neighbors were peeking through curtains and from behind fences. I could almost hear their internal commentary, "Oh no, not her again." I took another sip of coffee and tried to decide what to do. Do I step in immediately? Do I let her blow off steam while my kid stands there terrified? Do I pull out my phone and start filming for evidence and maybe a few laughs later? Karen wasn't giving me the choice. She was already lecturing my kid about violating the visual harmony of the neighborhood and setting a terrible example for others. I swear, if she had pulled out a ruler and started measuring the backpack, I wouldn't have been surprised. I glanced at my kid. Their eyes were wide, a mixture of confusion and terror. "Mom, Dad," they whispered, looking to me like I should solve this immediately. I could feel the neighbors' attention like a spotlight, everyone silently wondering how the parent would react. Finally, I decided to step forward. My first instinct was to calmly approach and diffuse the situation, but inside I was already calculating the best way to handle the madness. I wasn't just any parent, I'm a problem solver, and I've dealt with people much worse than HOA Karen before. She spotted me approaching and paused for a split second, just long enough to flash me a glance that said, "Who do you think you are?" I took another slow sip of coffee and allowed myself a small smile. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here she was, full of righteous fury, acting like she ran the entire neighborhood, and I was just casually strolling up with my coffee like everything was normal. Karen adjusted her stance, ready to double down, and the neighbors leaned a little closer, some hiding smirks, others quietly holding their phones. The tension was palpable. I could feel it in the air, thick like the heat of a summer afternoon before a storm. And just like that, a quiet morning had transformed into a battlefield of petty rules, misplaced authority, and sheer absurdity. I crouched down slightly to get on my kid's level and whispered, "Don't worry, I've got this." Little did Karen know, this was about to get a lot more interesting, and she had no idea who she was really messing with. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. Part of me wanted to just laugh at Karen, really. I mean, here she was, strutting around like the self-appointed guardian of backpack fashion, yelling at a 7-year-old over what exactly? Colors? Patterns? Honestly, I wasn't entirely sure anymore. But my kid was frozen, standing there like a deer caught in headlights, clutching their backpack straps with white-knuckled determination. I stepped a little closer, trying to exude calm authority. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice measured, "maybe we can talk about this without yelling at my kid." Her head whipped around to face me, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. "And who are you to tell me how to enforce the rules?" she screeched. Her hand jabbed at her own chest for emphasis, like that somehow gave her more credibility. I fought a smile. Inside, I was already drafting the mental version of my speech. Explain the absurdity, assert boundaries, stay calm, make her realize she's the ridiculous one, preferably without causing a neighborhood riot. I could hear the whispers from the neighbors. Some were laughing quietly, others were just shaking their heads. One guy across the street was pretending to water his lawn, but I could see the corners of his mouth twitching. I didn't blame them, Karen's theatrics were pure entertainment. But at this point, I realized that this wasn't just a minor morning annoyance. Karen had zero idea how far she had stepped into the wrong territory. She was about to find out, and I wasn't going to make it easy for her ego. I knelt slightly to talk to my kid, giving them a reassuring smile. Don't worry about her, she's loud but she's harmless. Kid looked up at me eyes wide. Mom, Dad, are you really going to make her stop? I swallowed. Yes, but let's see how long it takes before she realizes she picked the wrong person to yell at. Karen wasn't done. She raised her HOA rulebook like a shield. The neighborhood will not tolerate this kind of behavior. You're setting a terrible example for all the children. I couldn't help myself. I had to let a small laugh escape. Karen, my kid isn't breaking any laws, and honestly, you might want to rethink how much energy you're spending on backpack colors. She froze mid-sentence, blinking like she couldn't quite compute what I had just said. Then she laughed nervously, well, what I call nervous laughter, which was mostly her trying to regain control. Excuse me, who do you think you are? Ah, here it comes, the classic Karen bluff. I straightened up slowly, keeping my voice calm but firm. I'm someone who doesn't let children get yelled at over nothing, and someone who knows how to handle situations like this. I let that hang in the air for a second, letting the suspense build. She had no clue what I meant, but her body language shifted. She stepped back slightly, as if suddenly realizing the dynamic had changed. The neighbors were quiet now, leaning forward. I could feel the energy in the air, like everyone was waiting for the next move in a tense game of chess. Karen, oblivious to the fact that she was about to meet her match, tried to regain her footing. You don't tell me how to enforce the rules, she shouted, pointing a finger like she was commanding an army. I raised a hand, not in surrender but in calm authority. Karen, why don't we take a deep breath? I promise this doesn't have to be a confrontation. Her face twisted in confusion. It is a confrontation. Someone has to maintain order. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. That's when I realized Karen was about to make the classic mistake of doubling down, because in her mind, volume equals authority, and I could either let her flail or I could gently guide her into a corner she wasn't ready for. I took one step closer, slowly, like a parent walking into the lion's den of petty HOA drama. Karen, I suggest you lower your voice and maybe we can discuss this like adults. She froze mid-rant, scanning my face, trying to gauge if I was joking. The neighbors leaned a little closer, sensing something was about to happen, and right at that moment, I knew that the morning had just shifted from absurdity into something far more entertaining. Little did Karen know, she had no idea who she was really dealing with, and that realization was going to hit her harder than any HOA rule ever could. Karen's eyes were locked on me now, scanning my face as if trying to figure out what kind of parent I was. I swear, she was squinting like she could somehow detect fear through my calm expression. But there wasn't any fear, just quiet amusement and a rising sense of satisfaction. This was her moment, she thought, but little did she know it was about to slip right out of her hands. Who gave you the authority to interfere? She demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at me like she could physically push me away. Her HOA rulebook flapped slightly in the wind, giving her the appearance of some kind of self-appointed neighborhood enforcer armed with paper. I took a step closer, careful not to make any sudden moves. I'm someone who doesn't tolerate adults yelling at children over nonsense, I said evenly, letting the weight of my words settle in the air. I could feel the neighbors leaning closer, some trying to hide smirks, others clearly anticipating a showdown. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, and she muttered something about protecting the neighborhood and maintaining standards. Standards. I wanted to laugh so badly, but I kept my composure. I crouched slightly to my kid's level again. Stay calm, okay? I whispered. I've got this under control. They nodded nervously, gripping the straps of their backpack like it was a life preserver. I could tell they were both terrified and secretly impressed, probably wondering what secret superpower I was about to unleash. Karen, thinking she was clever, tried a different tactic. She started listing rules one by one in a loud, sing-songy voice. Rule 12.3, no neon backpacks. Rule 7.8, socks must coordinate with shoes. Rule 4.5, lunchboxes must not exceed maximum allowable width. By the time she reached Rule 9.2, I almost interrupted her to ask if she'd also included how many times you can blink in a day or the proper angle for waving at neighbors. But I held back, savoring the absurdity. Then she paused and looked at me directly, like she expected me to suddenly cower. And you're allowing this? You're letting your child break the rules. That's when I decided it was time to play it cool, let her stew, and build the suspense a little more. I straightened, took a slow sip of coffee, and looked her square in the eye. I'm allowing my kid to exist without being terrorized by an overzealous HOA volunteer. Her jaw dropped and she blinked several times as if trying to process my calm defiance. The neighbors were silent now, all eyes on us, holding their collective breath. I could feel the moment stretching, thick with anticipation, every second adding to the tension. Karen shifted uncomfortably, flipping through her rulebook like maybe there was some hidden clause that would give her authority over me. Spoiler alert, there was. She glanced around nervously, probably realizing that the audience she thought she had, those neighbors who watched and occasionally laughed at her antics, were now silently observing a new dynamic. I smiled ever so slightly and leaned closer. Karen, maybe we can step aside for a moment and discuss this calmly, away from my kid perhaps. She froze, visibly flustered. Something about my tone, the quiet confidence, seemed to throw her off entirely. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out whether I was bluffing. Little did she know I wasn't bluffing. Her shoulders tensed and she straightened, holding her rulebook like a shield. I think the children must learn to respect the rules, she sputtered. I raised an eyebrow, inwardly amused. And you think yelling at a 7-year-old is the best way to teach that? The street fell silent. I could feel the suspense building like a live wire. Neighbors were peeking from windows, some inching closer to get a better view, others discreetly recording on their phones. Karen's next move would determine whether she would retreat in embarrassment or double down and make herself an even bigger spectacle. My kid tugged at my sleeve nervously. Mom, Dad, can we just get on the bus? I gave them a reassuring nod, whispering, almost there, just a little longer. Then I turned back to Karen, who looked like she was teetering on the edge of a meltdown. She had no idea that the moment she realized who she was confronting was about to arrive. And right then, I knew the reveal was coming. I just had to time it perfectly. Karen's face was red, her eyes darting between me and my kid as if she couldn't decide where to direct her outrage. The street had gone completely silent. Even the birds seemed to pause mid-chirp, like they were waiting for the next scene in this little neighborhood drama. She clutched her HOA rulebook like it was a weapon. I am simply trying to protect the community. You have no right to interfere, she shouted, pointing her finger like she was casting a spell. The neighbors were now leaning out of windows, some trying not to laugh, others whispering to each other, probably placing bets on who would break first, me or Karen. I took a step closer, deliberately slow, my voice calm but firm. Karen, the only thing being violated here is basic common sense, and my kid's right to get on a school bus without a lecture from an adult who takes herself far too seriously. Her jaw tightened. You think you can just tell me what to do? Who do you think you are? That was it. The question hung in the air, heavy and tense. For a brief moment, Karen actually believed she was in control, that she was the one with power, that her rules were law. I could almost hear the mental gears grinding in her head as she tried to figure out what kind of authority I had. I let the silence stretch, just long enough to let the tension build. Then I leaned down slightly to my kid and whispered, "Don't worry, this is going to be over soon." My kid's eyes flicked up at me wide and uncertain, and I gave them a reassuring smile. Karen, sensing she needed to act, began packing a little. She waved her rulebook again, quoting passages, muttering something about violating the neighborhood covenant and setting a poor example. Every word she said made her look more frantic, more absurd. I couldn't help but notice the neighbors' reactions. Some were trying to hide smirks, others were shaking their heads in disbelief, and a few, those who knew Karen, were just waiting for the inevitable train wreck. I straightened fully, keeping my voice measured and calm. Karen, I'm not here to argue about your rules or the colors of a backpack. I'm here to protect my kid from unnecessary intimidation. That's my priority. She paused, looking like she had just been slapped with a sudden, cold realization, but she quickly masked it with indignation. You think you're better than me. I let out a small, controlled laugh. I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just think yelling at a 7-year-old is ridiculous, and honestly, it's not really helping your credibility. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through her rulebook again, desperately searching for a clause that could give her some semblance of authority, but there was nothing. She was grasping at air, and I could feel the suspense in the street building with every passing second. The neighbors were now leaning out of windows, some holding phones, probably recording this entire spectacle for posterity. Karen tried one last tactic. She raised her voice even higher. I am the neighborhood. I uphold the rules. I keep the children safe. I raised a hand, calmly interrupting her. Karen, I suggest you take a deep breath. I let that linger, letting the silence do the work for me. Maybe a moment to consider that there's someone in this neighborhood who doesn't tolerate adults bullying children over nonsense. someone who knows exactly how to handle situations like this. Her eyes widened, and for a brief instant I saw the first flicker of doubt. She blinked rapidly as if trying to process what I had just said. The neighbors leaned closer, sensing the shift in the air. Something was about to happen and everyone could feel it. I smiled just a little, letting the suspense hang. Karen, you might want to think about your next move very carefully. Her hands dropped slightly, the rulebook wobbling. She looked around, suddenly aware that the street wasn't just watching her, it was silently judging. And in that moment, I knew the big reveal, the thing that would completely shift the power dynamic, was coming. She had no idea who she was really dealing with, and that was going to be the moment that ended her morning of chaos in a way she would never forget. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the morning tension stretch just a little longer. Karen's eyes were darting between me and my kid like she was trying to find some hidden advantage, some loophole she could exploit. She was starting to realize that the usual intimidation tactics weren't going to work this time, but she still didn't know what she was really up against. Karen, I said, keeping my tone calm, controlled, just enough to make her hang on my every word. I think it's time you understood exactly who you're dealing with. Her expression shifted, part confusion, part indignation, part that classic "I'm about to crush this parent" look. She took a small step back, clutching her HOA rulebook like a shield, probably thinking I was bluffing. She had no idea how wrong she was. I let the silence stretch a beat longer, enjoying the moment. The neighbors were now fully leaning out of windows and doors, holding their phones discreetly, whispering to each other. I could feel the suspense thick in the air, every second heightening the tension. Karen shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that she had crossed some invisible line she couldn't quite identify. Then I said it slow and clear, letting each word hit like a drumbeat. I'm the chief of police. Time seemed to stop. Karen froze mid-gesture, her mouth opening slightly, then closing again, then opening once more. Her eyes were wide, her face a shade of red I didn't even know a human could reach. She blinked several times, trying to process what I had just said. The neighbors gasped quietly, a few stifling laughter, and I could swear someone across the street muttered, "Oh wow, that just happened." Karen's rulebook slipped from her fingers and hit the ground with a soft thud, the sound somehow echoing like a drum roll of defeat. You're the chief of police?" she stammered, pointing at me as if that alone would magically negate my words. I didn't know. I took a step closer, smiling just slightly, keeping my tone calm but with an edge she could feel. That's right. And you're standing here yelling at a child over a backpack when you have no authority to do so. Now maybe it's time to think about your actions and how they affect everyone around you. She tried to regain some shred of control, straightening her shoulders and muttering something about maintaining neighborhood order and enforcing standards. But it sounded hollow, weak. The sheer weight of her absurdity had been exposed in front of the entire street. I crouched slightly to my kid's level and whispered, "It's okay, you're safe." My kid's wide eyes were filled with awe, realizing that the parent standing in front of them was not just a protector, but someone who could command real authority when needed. Karen, meanwhile, was flailing silently, trying to figure out her next move. She waved her hands, sputtering, trying to recover the sense of power she had before she realized she was outmatched. But the truth was obvious. She had just met someone who could completely neutralize her theatrics. The neighbors were quiet, leaning closer, as if they were witnessing the climax of a tense, comedic drama. Some were trying to hide their phones, hopping to capture this moment without being obvious. The suspense hung in the air like a thick fog, no one knew how Karen would react next. Finally, she muttered something inaudible and tried to back away, but the damage was done. Her confidence was gone, replaced by a stunned, flustered embarrassment. I could see her mind racing. How did I not know this? How did I mess up so badly? I straightened fully, looking down at her with calm authority. Karen, I suggest you step back, think about your actions, and maybe reflect on how far your rules really go before imposing them on someone else's child. Her shoulders slumped, the rulebook was still on the ground, forgotten. The neighbors' whispers turned into soft chuckles, and I could sense the morning's absurdity settling into quiet triumph. The tension didn't disappear entirely, it shifted. Karen wasn't dangerous anymore, she was just humiliated, and the street had witnessed it all. I smiled just slightly, feeling the quiet satisfaction of knowing the ordeal was nearly over. My kid tugged gently at my sleeve, whispering, "Wow, that was amazing." I ruffled their hair and whispered, "Sometimes, standing up for yourself doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be smart." And with that, the morning chaos had officially reached its turning point. Karen had no idea what had hit her, and the street was buzzing quietly, already knowing that this story would be retold many times over. Karen blinked rapidly as if trying to reset the morning entirely. I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was desperately trying to figure out how to regain control, how to save her crumbling reputation in front of the neighbors, how to make herself look like she had the upper hand, but it was hopeless. She was standing in the middle of the street, clutching her rulebook like a lifeboat in a hurricane, while the entire neighborhood had front row seats to her meltdown. You can't just, this isn't fair," she sputtered, trying to sound confident but failing miserably. Her voice wavered, betraying the panic underneath her rigid exterior. "I am in charge of enforcing the rules, you can't just ignore them." I raised a hand slowly, letting the tension hang in the air. "Karen, I'm not ignoring them, I'm just making sure that no one is bullied over them." I let that linger, letting the neighbors feel the quiet authority behind my words. Their expressions were priceless, wide-eyed, half amused, half impressed. Some were whispering to each other, others were trying not to laugh outright. The suspense was thick, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for her next move. Karen flailed her arms, waving the rulebook. I am just trying to keep the neighborhood safe, the children, the standards." "Standards?" I interrupted, smirking just slightly. "You mean the ones you made up this morning, or maybe the ones that don't apply to my kid at all?" Her mouth opened and closed like a goldfish. I could see the panic mounting in her eyes, and I had to resist laughing outright. The neighbors were leaning closer now, craning their necks, trying to catch every word. Some of them were subtly filming the scene, already sensing that this would be viral material someday. Karen took a step forward, trying to assert herself. This is my responsibility, the community relies on me." I shook my head, trying to make my tone as gentle as possible while still asserting control. "Karen, the community relies on adults who don't terrorize children over colors and backpacks, and right now, that includes me." She froze mid-step, the rulebook drooping slightly in her hands. Her face was pale now, the red of earlier replaced by a sort of stunned disbelief. I could practically see her thought process collapsing. Wait, why isn't this working? Why am I powerless? The suspense in the street was palpable. Everyone watching knew that this was the moment when Karen either backed down completely or doubled down and made herself look even more ridiculous. And I wasn't about to let her double down. "You know," I continued, keeping my voice calm, "sometimes trying too hard to control things makes you forget the bigger picture. My kid is safe, my kid is fine, and everyone here is just watching someone melt down over nothing." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught somewhere between indignation and embarrassment. Her flailing hands slowed, then stopped entirely. She looked around nervously, noticing the neighbors leaning out of windows, some whispering to each other, some trying not to giggle. I could see the realization dawning on her. The entire street had witnessed her dramatic failure. Finally, she muttered something under her breath, almost inaudible, and stepped back. Her rulebook, once held like a weapon, now dangled limply at her side. The suspense didn't leave the street entirely, it shifted. Karen wasn't threatening anymore, she was defeated, humbled, and unsure of what to do next. I crouched slightly to my kid again, whispering, "It's okay, she's going to be fine eventually." My kid's eyes were wide with amazement, the awe evident on their face. I smiled slightly. Sometimes, people like that need to learn that yelling and intimidation aren't rules, they're just bad habits. Karen tried one last attempt at authority, waving her hands and muttering about community responsibilities, but it was weak, almost comical. The neighbors chuckled quietly, some hiding their phones to avoid being obvious. The suspense had shifted entirely from what she would do next to how long she would stay flailing before leaving. Finally, she turned on her heel, muttering something about checking the bylaws and enforcing standards elsewhere, and stomped back toward her house. Her shoulders slumped, her ego visibly deflating, and the street exhaled collectively. The tension broke, replaced by quiet amusement and a lingering sense of triumph. I stood there for a moment, letting the scene settle. My kid tugged at my sleeve, whispering, "That was incredible, you didn't even yell." I ruffled their hair and smiled. Sometimes, calm and authority speak louder than any shouting ever could. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains and fences, giving small nods, smiles, and knowing glances. Karen had tried and failed spectacularly. By the time the bus rolled up, the street had returned to its usual quiet, but the morning's chaos had left a mark. Everyone had seen what happens when someone like Karen meets someone who knows how to handle the situation. And I knew, quietly and smugly, that Karen would be thinking about this moment for a very long time. I watched Karen retreat toward her house, muttering under her breath, clearly replaying the confrontation in her mind 100 times. But I wasn't done yet. I could feel that lingering tension in the street, the kind that makes neighbors lean out of windows, whisper to each other, and secretly record what's happening. Karen had been humbled, yes, but if I didn't finish this carefully, she'd be back tomorrow with a new set of rules or a fresh attempt at intimidation. I turned to my kid. All right, it's time for the final step, I whispered. We're going to make sure she doesn't try this again. Their eyes widened. Do we have to get dramatic? They asked. I smiled. No drama, just a little firm authority, that's all it takes. I strode casually down the street toward where Karen had stopped, keeping my tone calm but firm. She looked up, startled, probably expecting me to yell, to lecture, or maybe even call the police. Oh, she had no idea. Karen, I said, stopping a few feet away, I think we need to clarify a few things about neighborhood interactions. My voice was light but carried a weight that made her shift nervously. She straightened immediately. I am just trying to protect the neighborhood, I finished for her, letting the words hang in the air. She blinked. I continued, keeping my expression gentle but serious. I understand you want to enforce rules, but here's the reality. Harassing children is unacceptable. Making parents feel powerless is unacceptable. And wasting your own time trying to be the self-appointed ruler of a street of adults is, well, let's just call it ineffective. Karen's hands twitched at her sides. She opened her mouth to argue but couldn't find the words. I let her struggle for a moment, letting the silence build suspense and emphasizing the shift in power. The neighbors leaned forward, watching eagerly. The street had turned into a live theater, and Karen was now the unwilling actor in the punchline. I reached down and picked up her dropped rulebook, flipping it open slowly. These are nice guidelines, I said, but here's something more important. Boundaries matter, but respect matters even more. If you can't follow that, then maybe it's time to reconsider how you enforce anything. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I could tell she wanted to fire back with some smart retort, some line that would redeem herself in the eyes of the street, but there wasn't one. She had nothing. Her ego had been exposed, and now she was fumbling in the spotlight, trying to recover like a comedian bombing in front of a tough crowd. I straightened, looking around at the neighbors, some of whom were trying to hide their laughter, others whispering comments like, finally someone told her off. Karen, I suggest you take a deep breath and think about this before you come near my kid or any other child with your rulebook again. She blinked rapidly, clearly overwhelmed, and finally muttered something under her breath. I just wanted to help. Her voice trailed off, weak and pitiful, the exact opposite of the commanding tone she had tried to project all morning. I smiled just slightly. Helping is great, Karen, but bullying is. I handed her the rulebook back, letting the message sink in visually and symbolically. Maybe read it again, slowly, and consider who you're dealing with before taking another swing at enforcing anything. The street seemed to exhale collectively. The suspense dissolved into quiet satisfaction. The neighbors smiled, some whispered congratulations, others nudged each other with subtle gestures. Karen's retreat continued, slow, flustered, and thoroughly humbled. Every step she took reminded me of how absurd her morning had been. I turned to my kid, who was still gripping their backpack straps nervously. All right, I said, ruffling their hair, you're safe. And tomorrow we'll make sure the bus stop is just for kids, not drama performances. They grinned, relief washing over their face. That was epic, you didn't even yell. Sometimes, I whispered, leaning down, authority doesn't need volume, it just needs confidence and timing. As we watched Karen disappear around the corner, muttering incomprehensible excuses, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. The street had witnessed the complete reversal of power, and I knew she wouldn't be attempting anything like this again, at least not without reconsidering the consequences first. By the time the bus arrived, the neighborhood had returned to its usual quiet rhythm. But the story of Karen, the overzealous HOA enforcer, had become something of legend in our little street, and I knew that the lesson here was simple. Sometimes, standing up for what's right isn't about yelling louder, it's about knowing exactly when, how, and to whom to show your authority. By the time the bus rolled up, the tension on the street had completely shifted. Karen was nowhere to be seen, probably retreating to regroup, reread her HOA rulebook, and rethink her life choices. The neighbors peeked out from behind curtains and doors, some giving knowing smiles, others discreetly nodding at us as if to say, well done. I crouched down to my kid's level and whispered, all right, you're safe, go on and get on the bus. They hesitated for a second, glancing around at the street, the neighbors, the faint trail of Karen's retreating figure. Then with a determined nod, they stepped forward, backpack bouncing with each stride, and climbed onto the bus like a tiny hero returning from a battle. I waved as the bus pulled away, feeling a mixture of relief and quiet amusement. Once it was gone, I leaned back against the curb and let out a slow breath. The street was calm again, but there was a subtle energy in the air. Everyone who had been watching seemed to know they'd witnessed something special. An ordinary morning turned into an epic showdown of absurdity, authority, and justice. From across the street, a neighbor popped their head out and whispered, wow, you handled that perfectly. I smiled faintly. It wasn't about me, it was about making sure no one else's kid had to deal with that kind of nonsense. The whispers continued as neighbors quietly discussed the morning's events. Karen's meltdown had become a cautionary tale in real time. I could imagine her now, packing her living room, muttering to herself, trying to reconstruct her plan for domination. She probably had no idea that the street had already decided the outcome. She was outmatched, outwitted, and thoroughly humiliated. I walked slowly back toward my house, ruffling my kids' backpack straps and enjoying the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. This wasn't just about standing up for my child, it was about demonstrating to the neighborhood subtly but firmly that authority should be respected but not blindly followed, especially when it veers into absurdity. As I reached the front door, my kid turned to me. "Mom, Dad, are we going to have to deal with her again?" I chuckled softly, "Probably, but next time we'll handle it even smoother." I paused and added with a grin, "Maybe I'll bring cookies, calm things down." The street remained calm, but I could feel the subtle energy lingering, a mix of humor, relief, and quiet awe at the morning's events. Karen's defeat wasn't dramatic in the sense of shouting or chaos. It was complete because it was quiet, controlled, and utterly undeniable. The neighbors had witnessed the power shift, and no one could question the outcome. Inside, I poured another cup of coffee and sat down for a moment of reflection. The morning had been anything but ordinary. A simple walk to the bus stop had turned into impatience, authority, and timing. I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity. Who yells at a child over a backpack color? Who thinks an HOA rulebook makes them invincible? I looked out the window at the street, imagining Karen silently plotting her next move. I knew she would try again eventually, but for today, the balance had been restored. My kid had learned an important lesson too, not just about standing up for themselves, but about how calm authority can speak louder than yelling or intimidation. By mid-morning, the neighborhood had returned to its usual quiet routine, but the story of Karen, the overzealous HOA enforcer who challenged the chief of police without realizing it, would linger for weeks, maybe months. The whispers, the laughter, the glances out the windows, it was subtle, but the message was clear. Respect boundaries, or the consequences might be quietly unavoidable. I ruffled my kids' hair one last time before heading inside. "Ready for breakfast?" I asked. "Yeah," they said, grinning. "And maybe tomorrow we can bring the bus a little earlier just in case Karen shows up again." I laughed, "We'll handle it together." As I sipped my coffee, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The morning had been chaotic, absurd, and hilarious, but in the end, it had worked out perfectly. Karen had learned her lesson, the neighbors had a story they would never forget, and my kid had a parent who would always stand up for them. Sometimes that's all it takes: calm authority, a little patience, and knowing exactly when to reveal who you really are. Today, justice had been served quietly, efficiently, and with a touch of humor. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.